Granblue Fantasy Relink, one of the biggest JRPG launches at the start of this year. I'm sure if you've heard of Granblue Fantasy, you've also heard of Persona 3 Reload. Both games sold over 1 million copies in their first week of release. That's amazing, especially since I've never heard of Granblue Fantasy in my life. So naturally, I checked out what the game was. Anime art style, check. Action RPG, check. Very colorful and smooth animations, check. Unique looking characters, check. It pretty much checks all the boxes in what I look for in a JRPG. I've played a lot of similar games that check these same boxes, and I've seen my fair share of these games. And after 13 hours, I reached the credit scene. Nothing wrong with 13 hours. However, for me, I did feel like I was yearning more in Granblue Fantasy Relink. You play as a mostly silent protagonist, and your job is to rescue Lyria, with the help of your crewmates and other characters that you can recruit on your own time. Similar to Genshin Impact, you'll have a tiny dragon named Vern speaking for you whenever applicable. Your 15-hour journey will have you island hopping around, chasing Lyria and quelling primal beasts. After that, if you're still interested, there's a whole post-game grind that you can do that makes it almost like into an MMO-like endgame, which at the release of this video will end with a raid boss-like encounter. But that's after like maybe 30 hours of grinding or so, with what I'd assume more endgame content updates in the next coming months. So, how was the 15-hour story? It is on the shorter side of what you see in other JRPGs. I personally think a good length for the JRPG is roughly like 50 to 60 hours. I have played others that are on the shorter side, roughly like 20 to 30 hours, and they had some meat to it and I really enjoyed it. Granblue Fantasy Relink, on the other hand, was very lackluster. The story starts in a very awkward place on the timeline where it pretty much kind of assumes you know where everyone came from and how they got together. Which is fine, but they never really fully explained it at all, unless you like reading like a journal entry. Characters' backgrounds and purpose in embarking on this journey with you are all stored in a feature called Fate Episodes, and it's literally just a block of text you have to read, which really sucks when I think that one of the main selling points of a game like this is the characters. They look very interesting, but the way you learn about them is in the most boring way possible. Not even a cutscene, it's just text with a still background. It makes it very boring, a side feature that makes it a hassle and feels like not that much effort was put into it. When I compare this to something as Star Rail, which is another game that has a main selling point of like the unique characters it has, I feel a lot more invested in those characters just by how integrated they are into the story. A new character could have like a very minor reference either through like an item or mentioned in a cutscene. Then they would have a physical appearance in a side mission. Then they would be announced that they're a playable character, then be integrated into the main mission. It feels like every character is needed to help paint the entire story. But in Granblue Fantasy, it almost feels like they've just been put together hastily without any thought. Again, there are Fate episodes that I did not bother with, but I never felt the want to know any of the characters more than to want to go through the painful experience of reading their lore. And especially, they were gating the amount of things that you can read about them based on story progress, which really sucked. It's like watching an anime, then having to wait until next week for the next episode. The overall story was also very lacking. You will travel to several different islands, but to me, it feels like you're barely at these islands and you're already on to the next one. It would have been nice to be at these places a bit longer and possibly develop the story a bit more. It just feels very one-dimensional and just, we have to get Lyria, and it feels like I'm just being dragged along. At first, I was paying attention to what was going on, but then I just became uninterested, and since it felt like I should have known more than what I already knew, the story itself was very monotonous, I then found myself skimming through the dialogue and came very close to just entirely skipping it. It just makes me a bit upset because there was a lot of potential to have a great experience. You have a good looking characters, good looking villains, great visual settings, and decent looking bosses. It's just a shame that you can never appreciate these, as it felt very rushed and felt like something was missing. The graphics look amazing. I honestly think this is one of the most aesthetically cool looking cel shaded games there is. I'm no art expert or anything, so I don't know the terminology, but the different biomes just have so much detail put into them. Going from like the ice tundra biome, it almost physically feels like it's cold only just by looking at it. The enemies look like they've been like frostbitten along with the environment. Then we go to the volcano region and looks like you really could melt at any time. They really showcase the different biomes very, very well and they look awesome. The characters themselves also look very unique. Each of their combat style is very unique, very cool, and very smooth. It's also worth noting that there could be a lot of things happening on your screen, but it feels like the game is still able to maintain its frame rate without sacrificing quality. It could be because of my PC specs, but I also don't think my PC specs are like high end enough for it to like keep its quality through the chaos. Like how it is with other action RPGs, you pretty much just spam the attack button. For different characters, you have different playstyles, different combos to perform, along with different abilities and skills you can do. There are a few different types of missions that you will encounter. There's Conquest, where you pretty much travel in a straight line, fighting waves of enemies on your way through the path. You have Survive missions, to where you just stay in an area and fight off waves of enemies for a certain amount of time. Then there are boss fights, in which you have to defeat a certain boss to clear the mission. And by far, the boss fights are the best thing about this game. The Survive missions tend to be very monotonous and very easy since it feels like nothing is really going on. You just spam a single button the whole time. Conquest is really only decent if the environment you're traveling through is interesting, but if you've already been through it, or it's something that you just don't visually like, the Conquest missions don't offer a whole lot of enjoyment. Boss fights are pretty good as they're pretty engaging for the most part. It just sucks when you have to fight these bosses again to progress to the end game. A game like Tales of Arise also had this issue where it felt like there was too many like animal bosses and not enough like unique human-like fights. I've said this before, but the campaign is roughly only 15 hours long, and since the Conquest and Survive missions are very boring and very quick, I felt like I was being dragged from one boss fight to the next. It never really explored the different islands or even had any big gameplay differentiation features between the different planets. Like, there could have been like an icy part in the tundra biome where it's hard to move around. In the volcano, I think you could take damage from the lava, but it was never like a real obstacle that you had to avoid. It was just there in an out of bounds type of way. We're given so many like unique characters with so many different abilities, it's kind of a shame the only place it was showcased was during boss fights. Outside of combat, there are two main vendors. One is to buy materials and recruit new teammates, and the other is the blacksmith. The leveling grind in this game is insane. I think max level is like level 200 or something, and I cleared the main story with roughly like level 55 characters. The skill tree is also very massive. Granted, most of the nodes are just like stat buffs like increased damage or stun power or whatever. There's like about 10 abilities I think for each character, and I'm pretty sure you can get all of them before level 50. So every time you're investing into the skill tree, they're most likely for very small stat increases. For some reason, this game gives me mobile game vibes. I don't know what their previous games are. All I see is like a 2D fighter spin-off game, I assume, on Steam. But it's the emphasis on like collecting characters and leveling them up into like insane like grindy levels. That on top of a relatively short campaign that never like really flushed out the story, the plot, or even the environment. And so there seems to be like a big deal on the end game aspect, like after you beat the story. But it feels very repetitive with a lot of recycled content and areas. And especially since during the story felt like very rushed in traveling through these different islands, I felt kind of bummed fighting the same boss again almost immediately after fighting it from the campaign. Yes, there are new bosses that appear in the post game, but it can't just be the bosses that make it feel significant enough for it to not feel recycled. Another thing you could say with having a weak and short story is that some people just want to play the game and not need to know what's going on. That's fair. Some people want to play things casually and not worry about the many story threads that are being unraveled in games like Star Rail or Final Fantasy VII. So from a very casual point of view, specifically you've never played an action JRPG before, it's very simple and it's fun bashing some monsters in the most forgiving way possible. But then you enter the post game, and it turns into something that only hardcore players will enjoy, but more towards like players that enjoy like MMOs or Souls-like games to where it's punishing and very grindy. It doesn't really make any sense. They added a new raid boss in a free update, and I kind of assumed that I could attempt it maybe after being a couple of like post-game missions, until I looked up like the actual requirements. Yeah, I don't think I want to invest 30 plus hours into grinding to attempt to fight a boss. But if that's your thing, I applaud you, but I just don't have the dedication to the grind, especially when there's like no notable fun checkpoints on my way to the max level. It's just a very weird divide to where it's a very casual game that only casuals and newcomers will enjoy. Then it turns into a grind fest to where only hardcore players will enjoy. And I'm not even sure what the game is trying to appeal for. But maybe because I don't belong in either of those groups, but I don't know. There were things I liked in Granblue Fantasy Relink, such as the visuals, the character designs, and the fluidity of the fights. However, the lackluster and short story never really made me care for any of the characters and the world itself, since I never felt attached to anyone or anything. The post-game content was not interesting and unique enough for me to want to stay engaged with the world due to the lack of story direction and the feeling of a lot of reused assets being put into it. Yes, there are things that people, most notably MMO and Souls-like players, will absolutely put their hands on and grind out all the levels and every bounty possible. But as someone who just wanted a fun and moving experience through the story and characters, I was very disappointed, especially since there's a lot of potential in the world and characters that they created to where something amazing could have been made, but unfortunately felt like it was shelved to a spot that would never see the light of day. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to this video if you like this type of content, and if you have any suggestions for any game that you want me to play, you can leave a comment down below or come join the Discord in the link below that I'm active in. See you guys later.